There's no question at all that the outcome of the US election is a victory for all progressive people in the United States and across the world. The defeat of Donald Trump, a nationalist, a racist, a sexist, a predator, a narcissist, a bully, and a serial liar, the leading figure on the global stage at the head of this wave of nationalism and racism and fascism, which has been sweeping the globe for 10 years now. His defeat is an enormous victory, and the celebrations on the streets of the United States are entirely justified. But we need to be clear that there are limits to the significance of this event. It was predominantly votes against Trump rather than votes for Biden that determined the outcome. It was in particular very large numbers of young people voting for the first time and very large numbers of women and Black Americans and Latino Americans who delivered the narrow majority that meant that Trump went down to defeat. It was in particular the energizing of the resistance to Trump as a result of the Black Lives Matter protests in the summer that drove this movement to get rid of him. But Biden himself is a mainstream neoliberal politician. He represents the center. He represents the status quo. He represents no significant change. He's not in any sense a social democrat, not in any sense a reformer. He has no significant program. He has no real solutions to the underlying crisis that has fed this upsurge of what we must call a kind of fascism in the United States. And that upsurge is still represented by a much higher vote for Trump in the 2020 election than in 2016. 70 million Americans have voted for Trump, despite everything. And that is an indication of the degree to which a far-right bloc, a huge far-right bloc, has emerged in American politics. And that far-right bloc is deeply now embedded in the American political system in the sense that we are likely to see gridlock at the level of federal government with the Republicans in Congress and in the Supreme Court, which has been stuffed with Trump appointees, blocking any attempt to bring forward democratic legislation. We're likely to see resistance in Republican-controlled states. In particular, we are likely to see the police and the security apparatus, the bourgeois state repressive apparatus more generally, acting to block progressive change and indeed to try and drive forwards reactionary change. There's almost certainly, for example, going to be a major attack on abortion rights in the United States. And as the police, who are infused with the politics of Trump, the police are natural fascists the world over, and not least in the United States, alongside that repressive apparatus that we saw, of course, in action in the summer in relation to the Black Lives Matter protests. We'll see those armed fascist militias that have been emboldened by Trump, no doubt, again coming onto the streets alongside the police. Nothing really is settled as a result of the victory of Joe Biden in the presidential election. We've won a breathing space. We've won a victory in the sense that progressive people are empowered and given new hope as a result of the outcome of the election, but everything remains in play. Critically, in understanding the modern form of fascism is to face up to the fact that the working class as a whole has been split much more decisively than was the case in 1930s fascism. In the 1930s, fascism was predominantly a movement of the middle class, supported by sections of the more backward, unorganized working class, but the bulk of the working class in the 1930s remained loyal to its own organizations, remained loyal to the trade unions, to the socialist parties, to the communist parties, up until the point where the fascists smashed them. This time it is playing out differently. This time, as a result of 40 years of neoliberalism, we have seen trade union membership falling, we have seen workplace organization shrinking, we've seen very low levels of strike action, we've seen support among working class voters for their natural parties of, that represent them, the socialist parties, the communist parties. We've seen that falling away. We've seen an atomization of the working class, a weakening of the working class as a labour movement. And what that has done is it's created the space for the growth of fascist politics, nationalist politics, racist politics, sexist politics, which would not have been possible to the same degree had working class organisation held up. And that matters for the system, because the system, the capitalist system, neoliberal capitalism, is facing a crisis of legitimacy. You go back to the post-war period, you go back to the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, even into the 80s in many places, there was a relatively high degree of consensus in society, and that consensus was based on the fact that the world economy, generally speaking, it was growing fast enough so that working people were able to secure wage increases, living standards were tending to rise, there were the resources for investment in public services, so there's public housing, improvements in healthcare, improvements in the quality of education. People had the sense in that period that life was getting better. They had the sense that their own lives would get better, they had the sense that their children's lives would get better, and so on. You have a massive counterattack against that social democratic consensus, that welfare consensus, if you like, a massive counterattack against that begins in the late 70s and then rolls out through the 80s and beyond, a kind of neoliberal counter-revolution, which is all about redistributing wealth from the mass of people to the rich and the corporations. And you can see the consequences of it in the grotesque levels of wealth at the top of society today, and the stagnant living standards or falling living standards at the base, the cuts in benefits and pensions, the decay of public services, and so on. What does that mean? It means that capitalist rule, class rule, can no longer be based on a broad consensual agreement that society is getting better, that we're all in a sense getting better off together. You have a very different kind of setup, a much more obviously unequal and unjust society with great pools of bitterness building up at the base of society. What happens in those circumstances, in that kind of crisis of legitimacy, is you get a rolling out of reactionary politics, a rolling out of the nationalism and the racism and the sexism and so on that is represented by a politician like Trump. That crisis of legitimacy, that political vacuum, if you like, is being filled by what Karl Marx, incidentally, in the 19th century called the shit of ages. All of these backward, reactionary ideas coming to the surface and being turned into an active political force, the effect of which is to split the working class. And you can see that in the voting figures in the United States. It's not just older white men, though it is particularly older white men who are most likely to vote for a politician like Trump, but many other working class people as well, persuaded by the kinds of arguments, the xenophobic arguments, the scapegoat politics and so on represented by Trump. This crisis of legitimacy creates a space for the growth of far-right politics, a kind of fascist politics, and the effect of that is to split the working class. And we need to stare that reality in the face. And what needs to happen to begin to win back the support of those disaffected working class people towards something that is progressive and positive and might lead us to a better future. It is, of course, not the politics of Joe Biden. It's not the politics of the centre. It's not the politics of the failed liberal establishment. It's not the politics of business as usual. It has to be a radical alternative, radical solutions that are going to begin to address the fundamental problems that are facing humanity and the planet. And in relation to the appeal of the far right, a politics which is going to begin to undercut a system which is based on rising inequality, increasing corporate power, running down of public services, stagnating wages, cuts in payments to the poor and so on. We have to have a radical redistribution of wealth, a radical redistribution of opportunity within society, and we have to begin to give people a sense that together we can make society better. And that means we need to see not just not at all a reliance on what a Joe Biden administration might do in the United States, but on the contrary, we need to see this breathing space which is being provided by the defeat of Trump, to see lots of self-organization, self-activity, self-mobilization on the base, to begin to build the kind of mass radical represented by the Black Lives Matter protest movement in the States in the summer. This movement welling up onto the streets of Poland in response to an attack by the essentially fascist government there to roll back abortion rights to the point where effectively you can't get an abortion at all in Poland. And as this movement, led by women, particularly young women, of course, comes onto the streets, it's unleashing a whole series of other popular demands as well. That's the kind of movement that we need to see developing across the world, but in the framework of those mass movements from below. Organisation which begins to put forwards a revolutionary, radical alternative to the neoliberal crisis which is upon us, as a way of undercutting the threat represented by this global wave of nationalism and racism and fascism that threatens the whole of humanity, and of course threatens the survival of the ecosystems of the planet, because these people, as along with everything else, are climate change deniers. So let us celebrate the victory which has been won in the American election, but let us also begin that business of building the mass movements and the mass organisation that we need to change the world. We are facing the greatest crisis in the history of humanity. Capitalism is driving us towards climate catastrophe. To understand how we got here and how we get out of it, we really need to understand human history. What we're trying to do here at the History Fix is to give us the understanding of the past that we need to equip us to fight for a better future. If you like what we're doing, please share and subscribe, and also contribute to our Patreon page. Thanks very much.